So in my last video, I made a video based off of the report that the Timberwolves were afraid to make the first pick, and I was kind of critical of their history as a franchise in terms of drafting and developing talent. But a lot of people viewed me as a Timberwolves hater. 2 people disliked the video, which is pretty uncommon, and even somebody unsubscribed. So today's video is a bit more neutral and laid back and not really critical. Even though if you watched the last video all the way through, you would know that I wasn't criticizing.
Shut up.
I wasn't hating on the Timberwolves right now, but whatever, that video's in the past. Today's video is about the news that Stan Van Gundy has been hired to coach the New Orleans Pelicans, taking over after Alvin Gentry. So to start things off, let's look at Stan Van Gundy's recent track record as a head coach in the NBA. Obviously, he started at teams in college, and he even coached Miami in the early 2000s, but that's kind of not recent. So we're going to start with his tenure in Orlando, which I think most people would view as his most successful tenure. He spent around 6 seasons in Orlando, and during that tenure, they were perennial Eastern Conference contenders. They made a couple of Eastern Conference finals, and they eventually made one NBA Finals appearance in 2009 where they lost to the Los Angeles Lakers. My boy Kobe. Myself and others view this tenure as successful because we have to look at the roster that Van Gundy was dealing with. Obviously, he had a prime Dwight Howard, which a lot of people forget about, was a perennial top 5 player in the league, defensive player of the year for like 4 years in a row. He was dominant, but that was the only superstar that Van Gundy ever coached in Orlando. There was never really a second superstar or even a second definitive star. I say definitive star because Jameer Nelson, the point guard, he was a fringe star. I think he made the All-Star game 1 time and then he got injured. So he was kind of a fringe star / all-star, but Van Gundy was never able to coach a team with 2 stars on the team, but he was still able to, like I said, get the Orlando Magic to be perennial Eastern Conference contenders, always getting above 50 wins. And I think we can view that as successful based off of the roster that he was dealt. And they weren't really ever able to surround Dwight Howard with more talent than just a bunch of great role players. Like, they had a bunch of great role players like Hedo Turkoglu, Rashard Lewis, Vince Carter. Obviously, they had a young JJ Redick, Marcin Gortat. They had a bunch of really great role players, but they, like I said, they never had that definitive second star. So yeah, Van Gundy's tenure, very successful in Orlando. He boasted a record of 259 and 135 in Orlando. And then we move to his next head coaching job, which came 2 years after his tenure in the Orlando Magic ended. He became the head coach of the Detroit Pistons for about 4 or 5 years, I believe, 2014 to 2018. Not only was he the head coach, but he was also the president of basketball operations. But since he's only the head coach for New Orleans, we're not really going to talk about what he did as a front office kind of roster player handler in terms of trades and signings, because he was not very good in that realm.
Motherfucker, are you out of your damn mind?
In his time in Detroit, but we're not talking about that because he's only the coach in New Orleans. In his head coaching tenure in Detroit, it was run of the mill. It was average. They had 1 playoff appearance in 5 years, but they were always in NBA purgatory, which is the position where your team isn't good enough to really contend or advance in the playoffs, but your team's not bad enough to really have high lottery odds for a high draft pick. They were kind of in that realm, always chasing an 8 seed in the Eastern Conference, but were more often than not unsuccessful. We can't really blame Stan Van Gundy for that. The talent level was never really that of a playoff team besides 1 or 2 years, because if we look at the best players that Van Gundy had to coach, outside of Andre Drummond, because Andre Drummond was the definitive best player on the team for most of his tenure, the best players outside of Andre Drummond that Van Gundy coached: a half season of Blake Griffin in 2018 after that mid-season trade, Tobias Harris for about 3 seasons before his prime, the max contract before that, Tobias Harris, Reggie Jackson for 4 years. I think the entire Van Gundy tenure had Reggie Jackson at the starting point guard position. A younger Greg Monroe Greg Monroe was actually pretty decent when he was younger. A young Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Marcus Morris for about 3 years, and then Brandon Jennings for about 3 years. So yeah, not a lot of talent really that Stan Van Gundy had to handle, so we can't really blame him for the lack of postseason success in Detroit. Let me rephrase that. We can't really blame his head coaching ability. But yeah, the talent level in Detroit was never that of a playoff team. Outside of Drummond, there wasn't that much talent. If we look at Andre Drummond specifically, kind of how he grew under Stan Van Gundy, I mean, the 2 times that Andre Drummond was an all-star came while he was being coached by Stan Van Gundy. And the biggest jump in Andre Drummond's game in terms of statistics and just adding another wrinkle, a bit more diverse of a skill set for Drummond, the biggest jump in that regard came in Van Gundy's last year as coach. There was a great improvement in Andre Drummond's playmaking ability. He was doing a bit more with the ball in terms of his creation, not just looking to score. He was setting people up off of double teams and whatnot. He jumped from about 1.3 and 1.4 assists per game to averaging 3 assists per game in Stan Van Gundy's last season as coach. And he even had a 3 rebound per game jump that season. So take that for what you will. But as a whole, Stan Van Gundy was below 500 in his tenure in Detroit, finishing with a record of 152 and 176. Having looked at Stan Van Gundy's past coaching jobs, now we have to look at his fit in New Orleans. And what jumped out to me was how we can help them defensively, because Stan Van Gundy's always made his bread for his defense. He's always been known as a defensive-minded coach. If you look at his old Orlando teams, they were always in the top 10 at least in the top 10 when it comes to defense. A lot of that has to do with having a prime Dwight Howard on your team, but you cannot discredit Stan Van Gundy for just simply having a prime Dwight Howard. Stan Van Gundy deserves some credit for those Orlando Magic defenses. And then even in his time in Detroit, though they didn't see that much winning success, he was able to improve that defense year in and year out. The year before he came, they had a really bad defense. I think they were like 20-something in defensive rating. In his first year there, they were 19th in defensive rating. In his second year in 2016, they jumped to 12th in defensive rating. And in 2017, they reached 8th in defensive rating. And then in 2018, his last year, they were 10th in defensive rating. Having said all that, New Orleans Pelicans, they really struggled defensively this year. They were a potent offense because Alvin Gentry is an offensive coach that likes to play up-tempo ball, score a lot of points. That fits a younger team, but they struggled defensively. They were only 21st in defensive rating. Stan Van Gundy can particularly help them on that side of the ball, and he has a lot of tools at his disposal. He has a great defensive backcourt in Lonzo Ball and Drew Holiday. Drew Holiday has always been a great perimeter defender, one of the best in the league over the past couple years, and Lonzo has really improved on defense over the past 2 seasons, and maybe he can even improve a bit more. He's still a young player. He's got great size at the point guard position. Hopefully he can improve Brandon Ingram on that end. Brandon Ingram was the most improved player this year, but mainly that came because of his offensive prowess, his offensive improvement. But he's kind of always been a bit mid on the defensive side of the ball, especially if you take into consideration the tools he has, the physical tools he has. He's very lengthy, long arms, about 6'8", 6'9" on a good day. Very athletic wing. He has all the defensive tools to be really elite on the defensive end. I guess he kind of just needs that extra push from somebody, and he wasn't going to get that from Alvin Gentry. Then we have to look at other young players that the Pelicans have in the front court that have some defensive potential. Jackson Hayes, he came into the league because of his defensive potential, his shot blocking capability. Hopefully Stan Van Gundy can kind of ground him on defense and not always go for highlight reel blocks, because we know Jackson Hayes can rack up a lot of blocks, but your blocks per game numbers don't always translate to how good you are on the defensive side of the ball, at least your defensive impact. Can Van Gundy get him a bit more discipline in terms of reading pick and rolls, knowing when to help, knowing when to switch and whatnot? Just, the mental aspect of the defensive game that young bigs kind of struggle with. Hopefully Stan Van Gundy can help Jackson Hayes on that end. And then finally, Zion. Zion was really poor on the defensive end this year, particularly on the perimeter. He was just a bit slow to really defend smaller guys. whenever somebody got to switch onto Zion, they'd always clear out the floor and ISO Zion and just blow right past him. And a lot of that is because the man he has weight problems. He came into the bubble overweight. After he came back from his injury in the middle of the season, before the hiatus, he was a bit overweight, and he was just slow-footed. He couldn't keep up with anybody on the perimeter, and that wasn't the case in Duke. He was insane on defense in Duke, but in the NBA, he's just had a lot of weight issues, which has compromised his lateral quickness. We might have to see a bit more of Zion at center because he's just not capable of guarding any smalls on the perimeter. Will SVG play Zion at center? And if not, if he plays him at his natural position in power forward, who is he going to start at center next to Zion? Is he going to try and develop the lottery pick Jackson Hayes? Getting your young guys a lot more playing time is essential, but you don't really want to put them in when they're not ready, and you kind of don't really want to compromise spacing next to Zion because Zion is not a go-to three-point shooter right now. You definitely want Zion in the paint banging bodies, and Jackson Hayes is not really a shooter, so unless Jackson Hayes can develop a shot over the fall, starting Jackson Hayes next to Zion would compromise a lot of spacing. You could start Nico Melli next to Zion. He is a really good fit next to Zion offensively because Nico Melli was one of the best shooting big men last year in terms of rookies. So that provides a lot of spacing for Zion. You don't have to throw the ball to Nico Melli inside for him to be effective on offense. He can just space the floor for you, stand at the corner, stand at the wing while Zion's banging down low. Or if they bring back Derek Favors, who's a free agent this offseason, even though Derek Favors didn't really provide spacing for Zion, they somehow made it work. The Favors-Zion big man tandem played decently well, even with the lack of spacing, but I don't really think they're bringing him back this off season, so that will be a question for Van Gundy to answer. Another question I have for the roster is how will he use Lonzo Ball? Lonzo Ball had a good year last year before the bubble. He was actually being a bit more assertive. He shot the ball well. I think he shot it above 37% on a lot of threes per game. I think he still needs to be a bit more assertive in terms of attacking the rim with the purpose of finishing, and just finishing through contact and through traffic a bit more at a higher rate. He was doing that better this season than he was in his Laker days, but he still has a ways to go there. In terms of Brandon Ingram, will Stan Van Gundy continue to encourage Brandon Ingram to be that guy? He was the number one option for about 80% of the year until Zion came back, and deservedly so. He was putting up about 25 points per game on great shooting efficiency. But the question that remains is, will BI still be the same guy even with a full season of Zion? Because there's been questions about the fit of Ingram on the floor at the same time Zion was on the floor, because Ingram didn't score as well or as efficiently or as much when Zion returned. And I'd like to see Van Gundy continue to build confidence in Ingram to be that number one shot creator on the wing, because Zion really can't create a shot on the perimeter like that. Ingram is your go-to guy on the perimeter if you need a bucket. So I would hope that Van Gundy can continue to encourage Brandon Ingram to be that guy, that go-to shot creator. And my final question is about Jrue Holiday. He's a great veteran to have on the team, especially for Stan Van Gundy, a new coach coming to a new team, especially a young one. A veteran like Jrue Holiday can help kind of bridge the gap between an older coach who might seem a bit more old school. Bridging that gap between him and to the younger players, that's kind of essential. That you kind of always want to have that veteran on a young team that's trying to find themselves in the NBA. Jrue Holiday is a good veteran, a good leader, but he might get traded if the Pelicans want to cash in on his value. Maybe Stan Van Gundy makes a plea towards the front office to try and keep Jrue Holiday for the reasons that I said before. And if it were me, if I were the general manager, if I were David Griffin, I'd try to keep Jrue Holiday. He's a great mentor, he's a great leader to have for a young team. So to conclude, how will it go? I honestly have no idea. I don't really know the length of the contract that the Pelicans offered Stan Van Gundy, so I don't really know how confident they are in him. Like, if they offered him a 5-year deal, I'd be like, okay, New Orleans thinks that they found their guy. But if they offered him like a 2 or 3 year deal, I'd be like, maybe they're a bit more hesitant on him. But I honestly don't know how it will go. Only time will tell, really.